On January 5, 1942, as Tokyo celebrated a string of victories, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was already looking ahead. He knew Japan's rapid conquest of the Pacific was a temporary advantage. He told his chief of staff, Matome Ugaki, that Japan had, at most, a year and a half to bask in its glory. After that, American industrial power would overwhelm them. Yamamoto, who had studied in America, was a reluctant warrior. He had opposed war with the U.S., and his outspokenness had forced him to command the fleet from his flagship, Yamato, for fear of assassination in Tokyo. Now he believed Japan's only hope was a decisive victory so spectacular it would force the Americans to the negotiating table. The stunning American Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April 1942 made this need for a psychological blow even more urgent. Yamamoto proposed an ambitious plan: lure the remaining U.S. aircraft carriers into a trap at a tiny atoll called Midway. But the Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a catastrophic defeat for Japan. 4 of their prized aircraft carriers were sunk. The news was suppressed, but the strategic initiative had shifted. While the Japanese Navy licked its wounds, the Imperial General Staff pressed ahead with a secondary plan: to cut off Australia by advancing in the South Pacific. Their next target was Port Moresby in New Guinea. When a naval force was turned back in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese shifted their attention to a different island. In July 1942, they began building an airfield on Guadalcanal, a mountainous, jungle-clad island in the Solomon Chain. In Washington, the aggressive and determined Admiral Ernest J. King saw the threat immediately. If the Japanese completed that airfield, they could dominate the sea lanes to Australia. He ordered an immediate counterstroke, the first American amphibious landing of the war. The task fell to the U.S. Marines. The planning was rushed, the intelligence spotty. The commander of the South Pacific Force, Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, was pessimistic. The man chosen to lead the amphibious landing, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, had just 1 month to train his force. The Marines, under General Alexander Vandegrift, rehearsed their landing at Coral Island in Fiji. It was a disaster. As they sailed toward their unknown objective, the mood was tense. The top naval commander, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, was so worried about losing his precious carriers that he announced he would provide air cover for only 2 days. On August 6, 1942, a fleet of 75 American ships steamed toward Guadalcanal under stormy skies. Thanks to Allied code breakers and coast watchers, they had a rough idea of what they faced. The Japanese, however, were caught completely by surprise. They believed the U.S. fleet had been broken at Midway and never imagined an American counter-invasion was coming so soon. At dawn on August 7th, the sky cleared. U.S. carriers launched their aircraft and warships began a heavy bombardment. On Guadalcanal, 11,000 Marines stormed ashore at Lunga Point. They met no resistance. The Japanese construction troops had fled into the jungle. The Marines quickly captured the nearly completed airfield. But on the small neighboring islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, it was a different story. Here, the Marines encountered the Japanese Imperial Navy's elite landing troops. The fighting was brutal and close quarters. The Japanese defenders fought to the last man, often choosing suicide over surrender. It was a savage introduction to the kind of fanatical resistance that would define the Pacific War. As the Marines secured their beachheads, the U.S. fleet was vulnerable. Admiral Fletcher, true to his word, withdrew his carrier force, leaving the transports and their escorting cruisers and destroyers without air cover. The Japanese reaction was swift. From their great base at Rabaul, Admiral Gunichi Mikawa assembled a force of 5 heavy cruisers and slipped down the Slot, the narrow channel running through the Solomon Islands. A faulty Allied air search plan failed to detect him. On the night of August 8th, Mikawa's force descended on the unsuspecting American and Australian warships guarding the landing zone off Savo Island. In a devastating display of night-fighting prowess, the Japanese sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers, the Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, and the Australian Canberra. It was one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. Stunned and fearing further attack, Admiral Turner was forced to withdraw the remaining naval support and the supply ships, even though they were only half unloaded. The Marines were left alone on Guadalcanal, with limited ammunition, little food, and a half-finished airfield. The Marines on the canal were now isolated. They finished the airfield, naming it Henderson Field after a pilot lost at Midway. It became their most vital asset. The first U.S. planes, a ragged collection of Marine fighters and dive bombers nicknamed the Cactus Air Force, flew in on August 20th. The Japanese High Command, still underestimating the American strength, sent a first wave of 900 soldiers under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki to retake the airfield. In a fierce nighttime battle at Alligator Creek, often misidentified as the Tenaroo River, the Marines annihilated Ichiki's force. True to his code, Ichiki burned his regimental colors and shot himself. The battle was a shock to the Japanese. They realized they were facing a determined and powerful enemy. Both sides began a desperate reinforcement race, with Japanese convoys running down the Slot by night, a route the Marines dubbed the Tokyo Express. The struggle for Guadalcanal was no longer a simple raid. It had become a brutal campaign of attrition. For the Marines on the ground, it was a hellish existence of constant shelling, tropical disease, and fierce combat in a steamy alien jungle. They were holding on by their fingernails, but they had secured a foothold in the Pacific. The long road to Tokyo had begun.